Southern California, Southern California's extinct flightless duck. And I know from past experience that there are probably a number of people in the audience today that aren't aware that there was a goose-sized bird, a flightless bird, that lived along the coast of California in the Pleistocene and through the Holocene and went extinct. Now, if you Google Chendytes, this is one of the images that comes up. You click around, you're going to find this one. This shows Chendytes frolicking with an extinct Pleistocene giant salmon. This was the sometimes referred to as the saber-toothed salmon or the spike-toothed salmon. These things got to be 9 feet long and they had those distinctive spiked teeth. They existed in the Eastern Pacific during perhaps as early as the Miocene. And we think that paleontologists think that they were anadromous like our present day salmon. And the fact of the matter is that they did coexist, best we can tell from the paleontological record, with Chendytes. This shows the range assigned to them. Again, they're a Miocene, Pliocene species, but they overlapped with Chendytes. Chendytes dated at least as far back as the Pliocene, but unlike the spike-toothed salmon, the flightless duck persisted well into the Holocene. I'll talk a little bit more about this in a minute, but it appears to have gone extinct about 2,800 years ago. Now, of course, I'm an archaeologist, I'm not a paleontologist, so what I'm interested in is talking about the human relationship with Chendytes, and in particular, I'm going to talk about the consequences of humans, of the involvement of humans with this particular species, the direct consequences, and then some indirect consequences that we're beginning to recognize with our more recent studies. Now, I realize that it might seem like this Chendytes is just the most arcane, obscure little corner of archaeological scholarship. I don't blame you if that's your first reaction to this, that this just seems like a funny little place in prehistory, that, you know, a small little area. But what, in fact, I'm going to try to convince you of tonight is that, in fact, some aspects of the situation with Chendytes resonate with issues that are being discussed currently in archaeology, and we can also perhaps even make some points that resonate even outside the world of archaeology and the study of prehistory. And that is, there's some bigger stories to be had from this. And Joe pointed out that in truth, Chendytes was not actually a little duck. It was a goose-sized creature. But since I expect that not many people are familiar with the flightless duck, there's some real basics that I want to lay out first. And so what you see here, this is an artist's rendition. It's highly speculative because the fact of the matter is the duck hasn't been around for 3,000 years, especially the coloration. So, I mean, this is one guess as to what the Chendytes might have looked like, but it's equally possible that it could have looked like this. I mean, this is a Southern California flightless duck. It could have looked like this. Now, this one, I think, is really, is highly likely that Chendytes looked like this, because this shows that this was a diving duck here. It's got diving apparatus, and apparently it couldn't fly. So it's possible that, you know, the Aflac duck is as good a representation as any for this particular species, given that we really don't know. This is a rendition of Chendytes from a website called Speculative Evolution. And some aspects of this are have some validity, but the coloration is somewhat questionable. What it does show is that Chendytes had massive lower limbs and very diminutive upper limbs, which is consistent, of course, with it being a flightless bird. The coloration here is based on guesstimates from paleontologists about what the most likely living relative is of Chendytes. And as it turns out, I'm going to talk about this in a little bit more detail later, this estimate is wrong. We've done the DNA, and it turns out the place of Chendytes on the bird family tree is a little different place than what we thought. But also important, and somebody else was talking about this earlier, these massive hind legs, which made the species made him an effective diver, also would have made really good drumsticks. I mean, this would have been an attractive bird if you're looking for something to consume. So the first report of Chendytes was made almost 100 years ago in this relatively obscure publication, a journal called The Condor. It's a paper published by Lloyd Miller, and they recovered bones of Chendytes from a strictly geological paleontological context, that is a non-anthropogenic geologic layer. And they were able to recognize, however, from the anatomy, from the very, very robust hind legs, that this was a diving goose, a flightless goose. So initially, though, it was just part of the geological record in 1925. But by 1949, they had discovered the remains of Chendytes in archaeological contexts, in particular on San Nicolas Island. Now, at the time of the discovery, that is, they found Chendytes bones in shell middens on San Nicolas Island, and amongst the shell and the bones of other marine birds and marine mammals were remains of this other bird that would have been consumed as a subsistence item. Now, at the time of the discovery, of course, we didn't have absolute dates for the middens on San Nicolas Island, but we can be certain, of course, at this juncture, that the temporal context would have been solidly Holocene. So in other words, Chendytes extended from geologic context in the Pleistocene and even earlier, well up into the Holocene. The question is, that's been around for a while, is how long did it persist? And so we jump forward a few decades. This was an important discovery on the coast of Central California in Santa Cruz County at an archaeological site, Santa Cruz 7. This was a paper published in the 70s by Victor Morjon, who was on the faculty at San Jose State University. This is a picture of the Santa Cruz 7 shell midden. And what Morjon did that hadn't been done before is he recovered the bones of Chendytes from the midden, and then he also got dates from the midden, and he was able to bracket it between about 5,400 and 3,500 years ago, uncalibrated. So that gives the first indication in real time as to exactly how long into the Holocene Chendytes might have survived. So just some facts that were established about the duck by the 1970s. So it's flightless. It was a diving bird. The flightlessness and the diving go hand in hand. The wings got small in order to facilitate diving. massive, powerful hind legs, and then the wings got small to get them out of the way so the bird could get into the water deep effectively. It existed in the Pleistocene, but it was also consumed as an indigenous food item. It's found in middens. It's been found at dozens of middens now in Southern and Central California and also in Baja California. And it's not present historically. So it's extinct. So fast forward a few more decades, how it is that I developed or started to develop an interest in to get involved with research on Chendytes, and I fully admit that I kind of backed into it. It wasn't something that I was especially interested in. I was aware of its existence because I did archaeology in Santa Cruz County before I came to San Luis Obispo 23 years ago. But when I got here, I was interested in this stretch of coast that's referred to as the Pecho Coast. Sometimes it's also referred to as the Diablo Canyon Coast. It's midway between Morro Bay in the north and Avila Beach. It's a fairly isolated peninsula. It's about 10 miles southwest from San Luis Obispo. And the Diablo or Pecho Coast was made famous archaeologically in the 1970s based on findings from this particular site, CA Slough 2. Slough 2 was investigated by a very good, a very accomplished Southern California archaeologist, Roberta Greenwood. She did her work in 1968. Roberta passed away in 2018. She was a highly respected member of the California community throughout her career. She worked for a long time. And the work that she did in San Luis Obispo at Diablo Canyon, in my opinion, remains one of the most important pieces of work, certainly in our area and arguably for the California coast in general. This is the title of the publication that she produced in 1972 on her work at Slough 2. She actually excavated 6 sites in anticipation of the construction of the Diablo Canyon nuclear power plant. This is the Diablo Cove in 1968. At the time of her excavations, she actually gave me this image. This is what it looked like then. But what's important, what was important and still important about the Diablo Coast, and was especially remarkable in the 1970s, is that she documented use of the coast, people occupying shell middens as far as 9,000 to 10,000 years ago. And the title of her monograph accurately reflects what she found. She had a 9,000-year sequence, and most of it was represented at this one particular site, Slough 2. Her dates were so much older in the 70s, especially from shell middens that were found in Northern California, that they were, in some circles, they were somewhat controversial. People thought that there were problems somehow with the dating. But Roberta was absolutely right, spot on. And she did an outstanding job of reporting this 9,000-year sequence. The Slough 2, this is what it looks like at that cove now. After construction of the power plant is scheduled to be decommissioned in 2025. A lot of the site is actually still in existence. She only excavated a part of it that was impacted by the road that was constructed to build the power plant. But what you have on this cliff here is midden that's spilling off onto the beach below. And she, as I mentioned earlier, as I said already, she wrote a very, very thorough, comprehensive paper or monograph, actually, on her findings. But she was unable to identify or analyze all the faunal remains from Slough 2. She analyzed a portion of them, but when I got to San Luis Obispo 23 years ago, the majority of the animal bones were still in the paper bags that they had been put into in 1968. Now, I was interested in the archaeology of sea otters. And so I secured a grant from the California Sea Grant organization to analyze all the bones from Slough 2 and also to get a lot more radiocarbon dates. Roberta was able to get 3, which for the 1960s was a significant number of dates. But by today's standards, and for a site that's had such a long occupation, I wanted to really get the dating nailed down more tightly. So we secured that a grant for faunal analysis and dating. And subsequently, my friend and colleague, Judy Percassi, this is Judy at the site of Slough 2. This is some of that exposed shell midden. The midden is 3.5 meters deep. That extreme depth goes along with that nearly 10,000 years of occupation. Judy completed analysis of the identification of the fairly substantial collection of bird and mammal bones from Slough 2, and we got better dating. And we published this paper describing the findings. And again, my main interest had been in the remains of the sea otter. But we noticed when we looked at the distribution of the changes over time in otter bones and other species, there was something that we hadn't expected. And that is that Slough 2 produced one of the larger collections of bones of the flightless duck. It turns out we have one of the larger collections from California. But the other thing was the patterning over time. So what this is, we're moving up through time on this axis. And what we have on this axis is the percentage of the faunal assemblage that's represented by these individual species. Now, we were perhaps a little surprised. The very bottom, the deepest layers at Slough 2, we saw a fairly substantial quantity of bones of the flightless duck. But what's not surprising is that we move up through time, the bones decrease in number. And by the time we get to about 3,500 years ago, there was only a few. And by the time we get to 500 years ago, there were none. And that's generally consistent with what we think the trajectory was for this species. And I'll just point out here, we're going to get to this in a little bit more detail later. At the same time that Chendytes disappeared, we get an increase in remains of the sea otter. But it was because of this finding that we had this fairly substantial number of bones of the flightless duck that we decided to look into the flightless duck a little bit more seriously. And so what we did is we contacted colleagues from other parts of California who we knew had recovered Chendytes bones. And everybody chipped in, and we directly dated Chendytes bones from a series of sites in Central and Southern California. No one had done that before. Everything else, all the dating that we have up until now is by association. But we really wanted to see if we could define a little bit more tightly, a little bit more closely when Chendytes disappeared. And so these are the dates that we obtain. And what we find is we have evidence for Chendytes being exploited as early as 11,000 years ago. This is a date that John Erlandson chipped in. He wound up being one of the co-authors of the paper from Daisy Cave on San Miguel Island. And then at the other end, the most recent date we had was when we calibrated with today's standards, about 2,800 years ago. And then we have evidence for exploitation in between. But it's the shallow date, the most recent date is the date that we, based on these, again, these are direct dates on the bones themselves. We're putting this as essentially the date when Chendytes disappeared. Now, the piece of the puzzle that we were able to also bring to the table in our study that we published in 2009 that hadn't been discussed previously at this in the year 2022, it's not especially remarkable, but what we suggested was the exploitation of Chendytes and its ultimate demise had a lot to do with Native people using watercraft. And here are illustrations of a couple of the forms of watercraft. I know most of you are familiar with these. The stone plank canoe, of course, it was used to access the southern and northern Channel Islands. And then the tule balsa, which was a more widely used, a simpler craft, real common in San Francisco Bay, was also used in Morro Bay. You know, in the 1980s and even into the 1990s, the prevailing wisdom about the antiquity of watercraft was that boats weren't used very early, right? People thought that boats didn't show up any earlier than mid-Holocene. Some argued that they weren't used until late Holocene. But by 2009, we'd established that based on radiocarbon dates from the islands, that we now have one date of 12,000 from San Miguel Island. The islands weren't connected to the mainland. The only reasonable way that people got there was with watercraft of some type. We don't know which one of these, and there are actually other possibilities as well. But the most reasonable explanation, in my view, for the old dates, and we have dates on San Clemente Island around 9,000, that people arrived along our coast using watercraft. And so what we suggested that it was those watercraft and exploitation of Chendytes with watercraft that ultimately brought about the demise of the duck. So we're fairly certain, I mean, we don't know this with 100% assurance, but as a flightless bird, we think that Chendytes lived on offshore rocks and islands. These would have provided very safe places for breeding colonies for the species. A flightless bird is not going to do well on the mainland coast because it would have been susceptible to predation by bears and coyotes, badgers, foxes, all the terrestrial predators that would have been here in the Pleistocene would have been big problems for a flightless bird, a flightless diving bird. But a flightless diving bird that lives in these types of settings is safe from terrestrial predation. And so it seems to have evolved that use of that type of habitat at the same time that it developed this there's this hyper adaptation for diving. But all that changed, of course, when humans arrived with watercraft. With watercraft, people could simply paddle out to these rocks. And I mean, this is the epitome of a sitting duck. That's what this is. Chendytes it's a sitting duck. It's a goose-sized bird. It can't fly. And so it was attractive and it was vulnerable. And so it's not at all, I don't think, unreasonable to imagine that people used whichever form of watercraft to paddle out and harvest the birds. But the other part of the equation, and this is slightly more speculative, and people can question me about this at the end if you choose to, but we're fairly confident that they also collected the eggs. If these are breeding colonies, you might as well collect a couple of eggs for an omelet at the same time that you're collecting your drumsticks. I mean, all of these things would have been they would have been so easy to harvest. What had been very, very safe settings for the ducks to reside in prior to human occupation. But once humans arrived using boats, the fact that they were vulnerable and attractive ultimately led to their disappearance. Now, with respect to the eggs, we don't have the eggshells from the middens. And this is, again, this is Judy, and this is a profile from the shell midden. And the reason that we don't have the eggs is that all of these little white specks here are all fragments of mollusk shells, mussel shells in particular. These shell middens consist of billions and billions and billions of fragments of marine shell. Almost certainly intermixed in there are eggshells from multiple birds. The likelihood of finding one of those Chendytes eggshells in a shell midden is definitely less than finding a needle. The likelihood is lower than finding a needle in a haystack, in my opinion. So it's going to be some future archaeologist, not me, that, I mean, eventually when they have automatic DNA analysis or something where you can generate the DNA profile for every single fragment in a midden without a lot of effort, I'm fairly confident that eventually the eggshells will be found. But for now, we don't have them. But I don't think it's too far-fetched to imagine that people collected the eggs. So we published this paper in 2009, presenting the results of the dating, but we also tried to make a little bit of a broader statement about sort of the implications of this anthropogenic extinction event that we felt that we were able to document pretty well, and what it might say for other arguments for anthropogenic extinction, specifically the idea that Pleistocene megafauna were wiped out by overkill. It's important to realize that it took 8,000 years for Chendytes to go extinct. It was an incredibly vulnerable species. It was a desirable species. They were able to exploit the bird itself and its progeny and the eggs, and yet it still took 8,000 years. Plus, they're relatively geographically restricted. They occurred from Central California into Baja California, but they're still just a coastal bird. I mean, that's a big difference. There's a big difference between that distribution and, you know, that of Pleistocene megafauna that occupied an entire continent. So we just raised some questions about what an anthropogenic extinction looks like based on what we found and applying it to the situation with megafauna. And to summarize what we said, I'm going to borrow a phrase from David Meltzer. So many megafauna, so little time. 37 genera of large animals go extinct, went extinct at the end of the Pleistocene. Some people argue within a few thousand years. That seems implausible given how long it took to render Chendytes extinct. So, that's one of the larger lessons that we learned from Chendytes, our early Chendytes studies. But from there, we've branched out. And I was very fortunate in the last few years to work with some researchers from UCLA. And we, Janet Buckner and David Jacobs, working at the Jacobs Lab, analyzed the mitochondrial DNA of Chendytes. And this is the first time that this had been done. And lo and behold, we found that where Chendytes lies in the family tree of ducks is not where people thought it would. It did. It had been thought, and that's where the coloration in the images that I keep showing comes from. The thinking had been that Chendytes was in the sea duck tribe. Sea ducks are a grouping, a worldwide grouping of ducks that dive. They live on coastlines. They dive for fish. Some consume invertebrates. It was not unreasonable to think that Chendytes might have been in this grouping, but as it turns out, the mitochondrial DNA says that they're in a different tribe. They're most closely related to dabbling ducks. Dabbling ducks don't, most of them, the living ones, don't generally dive that deep. But one thing that's interesting is that, and this is another worldwide grouping. There are 50 or 60 species over the face of the planet. And among those are these flightless birds from Hawaii. Now, there are several species of them. They were flightless because there are no serious terrestrial predators on Hawaii. Their flightlessness is related to their ability to walk on land. But because of that, when Polynesians arrived, the flightless duck disappeared, the flightless birds on Hawaii disappeared pretty quickly. So what the DNA test told us is that this flightlessness seems to have evolved in different times in different places on multiple occasions, or convergent evolution of flightlessness. In some instances to facilitate walking, and in other cases facilitate diving. But the other aspect, when thinking about the Hawaiian flightless birds, is that they disappeared really fast. Within a few hundred years after Polynesians reached the island, they were gone. The same thing in New Zealand. There were several species of flightless birds that disappeared when the Maori arrived there. And so it's interesting, on an island setting, these vulnerable species disappear pretty quickly, but on the mainland of the California coast, it took 8,000 years. So the DNA study, interesting in its own right, but it also really for the first time made me focus on the diving dimension of the duck's biology. As an archaeologist, it was the flightlessness that was the thing that I'd always sort of focused on. It was the flightlessness that made it vulnerable, that made it even easy to harvest, that made it vulnerable to overexploitation and ultimately being rendered extinct. So we started to think a little bit more about the fact that the duck was adapted, hyper adaptive to diving. And the paleontologists they recognized that, of course, a long time ago. But one other aspect of one of the other interpretations that paleontologists made, this is the only skull, at least that I'm aware of so far, that's been recovered of Chendytes. And they're based on the morphology of the skull and the cervical vertebra. The paleontologists thought that it was a diving animal that would rip shellfish off the bottom of the seafloor. They could dive deep and rip things off like sea urchins, for example. That is, it may have been, they thought, a diving invertebrate, that it was a diver that also dived for shellfish. So this gets us back to what my original interest in the prehistory of the nearshore environment along the central coast of this particular species of sea otter. Because today, the only animal, that has that diving for mollusks food niche is the sea otter. Sea otters are voracious consumers of shellfish. They eat abalone, clams, sea urchins. But it's interesting to see the possibility that while they're the only ones with this dietary regime now, that in the past they weren't the only ones. And so that brought us to the study that we just published, and these are very, very new results. And I'm really excited about these findings. What we did is we analyzed the isotopes from Chendytes, and we compared the isotopic profile of Chendytes with other species. Now, let me just explain this, the isotope axes. So the carbon-13 axis down here, I'm assuming you can all see my cursor, right? Can you see my cursor? All right, well, the x-axis, the carbon-13, is an axis that differentiates the degree of how marine the food was that an animal consumed. So that on the, with bone that produces a lot of C13, so that is the smallest negative number on the right-hand side. This is highly marine. This is deeper water, where on the left side of the C13 axis, we have a more terrestrial influence. Now, mind you, these are all animals that live in a marine environment. To get to true terrestrial species, we'd have to go further to the left. And then on the nitrogen 15 axis, this is trophic levels. So essentially at the bottom, on the low levels of N15, these would be plants. Then we get herbivores, then we get carnivores. So by combining these two things, we get to distinguish marine plant eaters versus marine fish eaters. And so each one of these circles represents the results of our analysis of these two isotopes for these different species. So in order to understand Chendytes, we got isotopic profiles from living, and then we also got some archaeological examples of other species whose diet we know. So for example, the start here, this is Phoca vitulina, the harbor seal. And this oval shows the dietary profile of harbor seals. And harbor seals they eat fish. So that's why they're on the nitrogen scale, they're on this end, the higher end. They stray into estuaries sometimes. So some of the fish and some of the things they consume are a little bit more terrestrially influenced, which is why it goes here. But this is consistent with an animal that's essentially a marine fisher and fishes in estuaries and in deep water off the coast. Phalacocerax, the cormorant, is here. Now this we thought would be the most likely species that would be an analog for Chendytes. It's a marine bird, lives on the immediate shoreline, also nests on offshore rocks like Chendytes used to. But what's really interesting is that the isotope profile of the cormorant is completely different from Chendytes. There's no overlap whatsoever. Finally, we have, with these flesh-colored circles, this overall oval. This is the sea otter. And the fact that we have these many readings that are low on the y-axis is consistent with sea otters eating shellfish. Remember, this is trophic level. Shellfish are very low in trophic level. But it extends, they're very, very marine. So this, but some of the sea otter readings get into this zone, which is consistent with sea otters occasionally consuming fish. So compared to those three knowns, we have the extinct species Chendytes represented by this oval here. And what's fascinating is that, first of all, Chendytes doesn't match any living species, which I suppose is what we should have expected, right? It's an extinct animal. Why would we expect it to match something that exists today? But the other thing that's really interesting is it overlaps. It overlaps with sea otters significantly, and also with harbor seals. So what we think, so this gets us back to our findings from SLO 2 that showed this. Again, this is a time scale going up through time on this axis. This is percentage of the species in the assemblage on this axis. And what we see with Chendytes disappearing is we have increasing numbers of sea otters. And so what a case that we're trying to make, these little guys, that the sea otters benefited from the disappearance of Chendytes. It doesn't, in my mind, it doesn't seem like that wild of a notion. You know, the food that was being consumed by Chendytes would have been available to sea otters. And as a consequence, sea otter populations were able to expand over the course of the Holocene. So to sum up, lessons from Chendytes. There are implications for the idea of Pleistocene overkill. We really wonder if that could have been accomplished in a relatively short period of time. DNA and the evolution of flightlessness, that flightlessness evolved multiple times for a variety of different purposes in different regions. And then the possibility that the disappearance of a species had consequences, and that and some of those consequences might be considered somewhat novel, especially for modern day biologists. But you know, when we talk about, we have an Endangered Species Act and we worry about the disappearance of species, well, the reason that we do is because there are unintended consequences. There are things, ecological relationships change potentially when you take a species out of the ecosystem. So these are looking at a sunset with a not flightless duck here. These are papers that we've published that basically lay out the cases that I've made today. And I just want to really end by thanking my co-authors of the most recent paper, David Jacobs, Judy Percassi, Brian Cotting, John Perrine, Joan Coltrane, and Janet Buckner. I don't think any of them are listening tonight, but I did want to recognize them. And I want to thank the Society again for giving me a platform to talk about this. And I'm happy to entertain questions. We can do it in the chat, or I don't know, the audience probably isn't, well, I don't, the audience, however, how do you guys usually do questions?
I have one.
Okay.
If they captured these ducks along the coast, they could have saved for a while. How far inland have these bones been found as a food source? Do you know?
Almost all of the sites are really right on the shoreline. They're shoreline sites. Virtually every single one of them is a shoreline site.
Hmm.
And they're not found, and they're on open coasts, not estuaries so much. So all the middens that have been excavated in San Francisco Bay, they've not found a single Chendytes. At Morro Bay, we did a massive project a few years ago We have thousands. We did find one Chendytes bone in among thousands and thousands of bird and mammal remains. They're not found very far inland. They're not found at estuarine shell middens. They're found on open coastal sites almost immediately on the coast. There's one site in Baja, I'm not exactly sure where it is, but the ones that I am aware of are mostly pretty close to the coast.
Joe? Paul
Yeah.
Chase here.
Hi, Paul.
Dr. Nancy Wiley reported that there were Chendytes on the Bolsa Chica Mesa. She had recovered them in the archaeology there.
Okay. Yeah, I mean, we tried to get all of them. There's certainly some that we may not have gotten. That's a little further inland than I was aware of. Most of the ones that I know are on the immediate coast.
Was there something about the anatomy of or the bones or anything that would have driven them to go after this particular animal, or was it just the meat, do you think?
Well, I think it was the meat and the fact that it was just so easy to get them. I mean, I really do. They were sitting ducks. I think when you combine, you've got a goose-sized animal that can't fly. Oh gosh, you just paddle up and just grab them. And then there were the eggs.
This is Steve O'Neill. It almost seems to me that, as you said, you could just paddle up to it, knock it over the head. You didn't have to net it. You didn't have to shoot it with an arrow. You could just go right up to it and club it.
Yeah, that's what we think. That's what I think.
Does anybody else have any questions?
Yeah, there's a couple questions on the chat.
Okay.
Yeah, let's see. So
Joe, Paul Chase here. I would pose it also would be easy to capture with a net, just a cast net, like you capture rabbits. But if you threw a net over one of these and tangled it, all you'd have to do is drag the net in.
yeah, no, I don't disagree at all. You're 100% right. I mean, that's another way to go about it. Would have been incredibly effective. Don Lather has asked, wouldn't the duck egg shell frags be pretty distinct physically from marine shell? I don't think so. I mean, we haven't been able to recognize them so far. My point is that we're not able to recognize them. I don't think we're missing them because they're not there. I think they're not that distinctive. Finding eggshells of any type in a shell midden, in my view, and I'd spend a lot of time sorting shell middens, my suspicion is that they're very indistinct from mussel shells, for example. Let's see what else.
I have a question.
Yes.
I'm Sandy Larson. I did a paper a while back about megafauna extinction, and so I'm kind of curious about the implications that you're bringing up here. The fact that it took so long for these ducks to disappear after man came here, does that imply that maybe also that the overkill theory is not quite what some people think it is?
That's definitely what that's what I'm trying to imply. Yeah.
Okay.
Yeah.
Okay.
Sure.
Thank you.
Somebody in the chat said a net makes sense. And yeah, I don't disagree with that. I agree wholeheartedly. I mean, a net, they could have really harvested efficiently with nets.
Okay, well, does anybody else have any questions?
I have one question for you. You mentioned as the ducks declined, the sea otters became more abundant. Before humans, were the ducks just more efficient and that's why there weren't so many otters? Did they just fill that niche better?
I think that they filled that niche. They had part of the niche. I think that they had part of the niche. And how it, yeah, and that's a great question. I don't have a 100% certain answer for that. Somehow they managed to hold part of that niche. That's really all I've got. But your question is a good one.
Does it seem to you that when both the sea otters and these sea geese were out there together, the geese could more easily go after the fish, and they wouldn't have been able to, or wouldn't have been interested in the shellfish that the sea otters would have been going after. And with the demise of the sea geese, the sea otters could spread to both types of food.
Yeah, the sea otters definitely had the ability. They have a more diverse dietary range. They've got their mammals, so they have the ability, and it's shown with historic populations that they could shift their diet a little bit and eat a variety of things. The duck may have had a more specialized focus. They may have been especially focused on sea urchins. That was the one species that the paleontologists mentioned in particular. That they may have been really good at ripping those off the bottom of the ocean.
In the middens, after this bird became extinct, do you find more of other materials, shells or other animal bones or something that made up the diet that these birds was giving them?
Well, fish bones increase after that time, and the sea otter seems to have sort of replaced the flightless duck in terms of, and the sea otters were probably exploited both for their furs and as a food item. I don't think they would have left them uneaten. But so fish increases, and initially, actually, which is kind of interesting, we see, at least to begin with, an increase in red abalone after before the sea otter numbers get really high.
Well, okay, if there's no more questions, I want to thank you so very much, Dr. Jones. I'm going to be sending you this certificate
Oh, great.
of appreciation that you can hang on your wall of other attributes. And I just want to say next month, we're going to have Dr. Torben Rick about the cultural keystone places in the Chumash landscapes, Point Conception, California. He is back at the Smithsonian, and he's going to be talking to us real time, East Coast from the Smithsonian to us for this talk. We really appreciate. And I don't know if anybody else has any other questions or comments before we go. It's not. Thank you again, Dr. Jones.
All right. Thank you very much for having me.
All right. Good night, everybody.
Thank
Drive
you.
safe. Drive safely getting home.
Yes, thank you.
Okay.
Good night, gang.
Bye-bye.
Good night.